The city of Ashboro hummed with the quiet rhythm of early autumn, its streets lined with maples that bled crimson and gold. Elias Turner, 24 and restless, lived in a small apartment above a bookstore that smelled of aged paper and coffee. Ashboro was a coastal town, all salt air and gray skies, where the ocean whispered secrets to anyone who lingered too long at the shore. Elias was a graphic designer by trade, but his real passion was music late-night sessions strumming his guitar, piecing together melodies that felt like fragments of his soul. He was the kind of person who noticed details, the way light fractured through a raindrop, the cadence of a stranger's laugh. It was this attentiveness that made him fall so hard, so fast, when he met Lila. Lila Monroe lived 300 miles away in Cresthaven, a sprawling city of glass towers and neon lights, where the pulse of life was relentless. Cresthaven was everything. Ashboro wasn't. Loud, chaotic, a place where dreams went to fight for survival. Lila, 22, was a barista by day and a poet by night, her words sharp and vivid, like shards of stained glass. Her apartment was a cluttered sanctuary of books, half-finished journals, and plants she somehow kept alive despite her chaotic schedule. She had a smile that could stop traffic, but her eyes carried a weight, a hint of something guarded, like a door left slightly ajar. They met in the most modern of ways, a music app where users shared playlists like love letters. Elias, under the username Costalkered, had uploaded a playlist of lo-fi tracks laced with acoustic covers, titled Songs for Rainy Days. Lila, under Crestpod, stumbled across it one sleepless night, her headphones a shield against the city's noise. She left a comment. This feels like walking through a storm and finding a warm cafe at the end. Who are you? Elias, who rarely checked his notifications, saw it the next morning and felt his heart skip. He replied, just a guy who likes the sound of rain. Who's this poet stealing my vibes? What began as a playful exchange grew into daily messages, then voice calls that stretched past midnight. Elias would sit on his balcony, guitar in lap, the phone propped against a mug, listening to Lila's voice soft but edged, like velvet over steel as she read him fragments of her poetry. The city chews up dreamers, spits out their bones, but I keep writing, carving my name in stone. Her words hit him like a tide, pulling him under. He'd play her snippets of his songs, shy at first, then bolder when she gasped or laughed or said, Elias, that's you in those chords. They traded stories of their worlds, his quiet walks along the pier, her chaotic shifts at the cafe where she memorized regulars' orders like lines of verse. Elias fell first, though he didn't admit it, not even to himself. It was in the way he'd check his phone every hour, hoping for her name to light up the screen. It was the ache when she described Cresthaven's skyline, all fire and glass, and he imagined her standing beneath it, so far away. He'd never seen her face, not yet they'd agreed to keep it old school, no photos, just voices and words, but he pictured her anyway. Dark hair, maybe, curling over her shoulders. Eyes that held stories. A laugh that could break him. 3 months into their connection, they planned a video call. Elias spent the day cleaning his apartment, as if she could see the clutter through the phone. He wore a navy sweater, the one his sister said brought out his eyes, and sat at his desk, with the ocean visible through the window behind him. When Lila's call came through, his breath caught. She was real. Her hair was dark, but shorter than he'd imagined, framing a face that was all sharp angles and soft warmth. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold, and when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through Cresthaven's smog. Elias, she said, her voice familiar but new. Now tied to this living, breathing person. You're exactly how I thought you'd be. Liar, he teased, grinning. You thought I'd have a beard. She laughed, and it was better than any song he'd ever written. They talked for hours, the distance shrinking with every word. She showed him her tiny balcony, crowded with potted plants, and he showed her the view of Ashborough's lighthouse, its beam cutting through the dusk. By the end of the call, Elias knew he was in trouble. He was falling hard for a girl in another city, a girl who felt like the missing note in his melody. Over the next few months, their connection deepened. They sent each other gifts. Lila mailed him a leather-bound journal with a note tucked inside. Write your songs here, co-stalkered. Elias sent her a seashell he'd found on the beach, polished by the waves, with a scrawled message, hold this to your ear when you miss me. They planned a meeting, saving up for train tickets too. Split the distance, dreaming of a weekend where they could finally touch. Elias would lie awake, imagining her hand in his, her laughter close enough to feel. He wrote a song for her, Cresthaven Lights, and played it over a call. She cried, her voice thick when she said, no one's ever made me feel like this. But there were cracks, subtle at first. Lila's life in Cresthaven was a whirlwind. Late shifts, open mic nights, friends who pulled her into the city's chaos. Sometimes she'd go quiet for days, her messages short, apologetic. Sorry, work's insane. Or got caught up with friends. Elias didn't mind, or told himself he didn't. He'd filled the silence with his guitar, strumming melodies that carried her name. But he noticed how she dodged questions about her past, her guarded eyes flickering when he asked about old relationships. Nothing worth talking about, she'd say, and he'd let it go, trusting her. He told her he loved her. 6 months after their first message, during a call at 2 a.m., the words slipped out, raw and unpolished. As he sat on his balcony with the ocean roaring in the background, Lila, I'm in love with you, he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. There was a pause long enough to make his stomach twist before she whispered, I love you too, Elias. Her voice cracked, and he thought it was emotion, not doubt. He didn't see the way her eyes darted away from the screen, or the way her fingers tightened around her coffee mug. Elias threw himself into the feeling, reckless and whole. He designed a poster for one of her poetry readings, a digital sketch of Cresthaven's skyline with her words woven into the stars. He sent it to her, and she hung it in her apartment, sending him a photo of it on her wall. He started saving more aggressively for their meeting, picking up freelance gigs to cover the cost. He dreamed of her in Ashborough, walking the pier with him, her hand warm in his. He couldn't know that in Cresthaven, Lila's life was messier than she let on. That her nights weren't always spent writing poetry. That her heart wasn't as steady as his. One night, during a call, she seemed distant, her eyes fixed somewhere off-screen. You okay? Elias asked, his guitar resting on his knee. Yeah, she said, too quickly. Just tired. The city, you know, it never stops. He nodded, accepting it. Play me something, she said. And he did, a soft melody he'd been working on. She closed her eyes, listening. And for a moment, he thought everything was fine. He didn't know about the guy at the cafe, the one who'd been lingering at her counter, leaving her tips and compliments that made her blush. He didn't know about the late-night texts she hadn't told him about, or the way she'd started questioning whether love could survive 300 miles. Elias was all in, his heart laid bare in every song, every message, every call. He saw Lila as his muse, his anchor, the girl who made his quiet world feel alive. He didn't see the storm brewing in Cresthaven, the choices Lila would make that would shatter him. For now, he was just a boy in love, staring at the stars over Ashborough, whispering her name into the night. The winter air in Ashborough carried a bite, the kind that made Elias pull his scarf tighter as he walked the pier, his phone pressed to his ear. 9 months had passed since he first stumbled across Lila's comment on his playlist, and the distance between them, 300 miles of highway and heartache, felt both infinite and conquerable. Elias was still all in, his love for Lila a steady flame that burned through the gray days of his coastal town. Their plan to meet was closer now, just weeks away, with train tickets booked for a weekend in a neutral city halfway between Ashborough and Cresthaven. He could almost feel her hand in his, the weight of her laughter against his shoulder. But in Cresthaven, Lila's world was shifting, and the cracks Elias had only glimpsed were widening into chasms. Their calls, once a nightly ritual, had become less predictable. Lila's life was a whirlwind. She'd been promoted to shift manager at the cafe, a role that came with longer hours and more responsibility. Her poetry readings had gained traction, drawing crowds at Cresthaven's underground venues, where she'd stand under dim lights, her words slicing through the smoke-filled air. Elias loved this about her, the way she carved out space in a city that devoured dreamers. He'd listen to her talk about her performances, her voice bright with adrenaline, and he'd imagine her on stage, fierce and untouchable. But he didn't hear the exhaustion in her pauses, the way her laughter sometimes sounded forced. He didn't see the way her eyes lingered on someone else. His name was Julian, a regular at the cafe with a crooked smile and a knack for lingering past closing. He was a photographer, all sharp cheekbones and restless energy, the kind of guy who carried a camera like an extension of himself. He'd started coming in during Lila's shifts, ordering black coffee and asking about her poetry. At first, it was harmless small talk, a compliment on her latest reading. But Julian had a way of looking at her, like she was the only person in the room. And in Cresthaven's chaos, that attention felt like oxygen. Lila didn't tell Elias about him. Not at first. She told herself it was nothing, just a customer who liked her work. But when Julian showed up at one of her readings, clapping louder than anyone, she felt a spark she hadn't expected. Elias, in Ashborough, was oblivious to the shift. He was too busy pouring himself into their connection, planning their meeting with the precision of a lovesick architect. He'd booked a small airbnb in the halfway city of Millhaven, a quaint town known for its cobblestone streets and riverside cafes. He imagined them walking hand in hand, her teasing him about his sweater collection, him stealing a kiss under a street lamp. He sent her a playlist titled Millhaven Dreams, filled with songs that felt like their future soft acoustics. Hopeful lyrics. Lila listened to it during her breaks, her heart twisting as she read his note for our weekend. Counting the days. She wanted to feel the same unbridled joy, but something in her was unraveling. Cresthaven was relentless, its pace wearing Lila down. The cafe was understaffed. Her apartment was a mess, and her poetry, once her escape, felt like another demand. She'd always been restless, a girl who chased intensity, and Elias's steady love his songs. His seashells, his quiet devotion sometimes felt too soft for the jagged edges of her life. She loved him, she did, but his world felt so far away, a watercolor painting against her neon reality. Julian, though, was right there. He'd linger after her shifts, offering to walk her home, his camera slung over his shoulder. One night, he showed her a photo he'd taken of her at a reading, her face half-lit, her eyes fierce. "This is you," he said, his voice low. "This is what the city sees." Lila felt seen in a way she hadn't in months. She didn't mean to let it happen. It started with a text Julian asking if she'd like to grab a drink after her next reading. She said yes, telling herself it was just networking, a chance to talk art with someone who got Cresthaven's pulse. But the drinks turned into late night. Walks, his hand brushing hers, his laughter filling the spaces where Elias's voice used to be. She still called Elias, still laughed at his stories about Ashborough's quirky bookstore customers. But her responses were shorter. Her attention split. Elias sensed it, though he didn't want to. "You sound tired," he'd say, and she'd laugh it off. "Just the city, Elias. You know how it is." He didn't. Not really. Ashborough was slow, predictable. A place where the biggest drama was a storm knocking out power. He'd sit on his balcony, guitar in hand, working on a new song for Lila, one he planned to play when they finally met. He called it Halfway Home, a melody that wove together the ache of distance and the promise of togetherness. He played it for her over a call, his voice soft and raw. "This is for Millhaven," he said, "for us." Lila listened, her chest tight, tears pricking her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and she meant it. But she didn't tell him about the bar she'd been at the night before, or the way Julian's hand had lingered on her waist as they said goodbye. The closer the Millhaven trip got, the more Lila felt trapped. She loved Elias's kindness, his music, the way he saw her as more than Cresthaven's chaos. But Julian was immediate, tangible, a flame that burned to close, to resist. One night, after a poetry reading where Julian had been in the front row, they ended up at his apartment. It was a small, cluttered space filled with prints of his photos, the air thick with the smell of developing chemicals. They talked for hours, then stopped talking. When he kissed her, Lila didn't pull away. It was quick, reckless, a moment. She could have stopped but didn't. She left before dawn, her heart pounding with guilt, telling herself it was a mistake, a one-time thing. She wouldn't tell Elias, she couldn't. But the guilt didn't stop her from seeing Julian again. It was easier to slip into his orbit than to face the distance between her and Elias. Julian was there, his presence a distraction from the pressure of her job, her art, her doubts. They'd meet after her shifts, sharing cheap wine and stories of Cresthaven's underbelly. Each time, Lila told herself it was nothing serious, just a fling to get her through the city's grind. But every text she sent Julian, every moment she spent with him, was a betrayal of the boy 300 miles away who was counting down the days to Millhaven. Elias, meanwhile, was living for that weekend. He'd bought a new jacket, one Lila had teased him about needing, something that doesn't scream small-town poet, she'd said, laughing. He practiced his songs, imagining her reaction when he played them in person. He didn't notice the way her calls had grown shorter, or how her laughter didn't reach her eyes on their video chats. He was too caught up in the dream of her, the girl he'd built into his songs, his future. But there were moments, small, nagging ones, where he felt the distance more than usual. A missed call that went unanswered for days, a text that felt too curt. He pushed the doubts down, blaming the city, her schedule, anything but her. One night, a week before Millhaven, Lila called him late, her voice unsteady. "Elias, I'm scared," she said. And he sat up, his guitar sliding to the floor. "Scared of what?" he asked, his heart racing. "The trip, me," she laughed, but it was hollow. "No, not you. Just this, us. It's so big, you know. What if it's not the same in person?" He swallowed, his throat tight. "It'll be better," he said. "Lila, I know you. I love you. It's going to be us. Just like this, but closer." She was quiet. For too long. "Yeah," she finally said. "You're right." But she didn't tell him about Julian, or the kiss, or the nights she'd spent wondering if she could be the girl Elias thought she was. She wanted to be, but Cresthaven had its claws in her, and Julian was a temptation she couldn't shake. The night before the Millhaven trip, Elias sat on his balcony, the ocean roaring below. He wrote Lila a letter, one he planned to give her when they met. "I've never been good at saying everything out loud," he wrote, "but you're my home, Lila. No matter how far apart we are, you're where I belong." He folded it carefully, tucking it into his bag. In Cresthaven, Lila was packing too, her hands shaking as she folded clothes she'd barely wear. Julian had texted her that morning, asking her to stay, to skip the trip. She hadn't replied, but his words echoed in her mind louder than Elias's song. The stage was set for Millhaven, for the moment they'd both been dreaming of. Elias was ready, his heart open, his love unshaken. Lila was unraveling, torn between the boy who loved her from afar and the one who'd pulled her into Cresthaven's chaos. The weekend would change everything, but not in the way Elias hoped. The cracks were too deep, and Lila's choices were about to break more than just her own heart. The train to Millhaven rattled through the countryside, a blur of green fields and gray skies outside Elias's window. His bag sat at his feet, the letter for Lila tucked carefully inside, its edges worn from the times he'd unfolded and reread it. Ashborough was behind him now, its quiet waves and salt-soaked air a memory as he hurtled toward the weekend he'd dreamed of for months. His guitar case rested against his knee, a silent promise of the songs he'd play for her. He imagined Lila on her own train, leaving Cresthaven's chaos behind, her smile waiting for him at the station. He couldn't know that Lila was already carrying a secret that would unravel everything. In Cresthaven, Lila's train had left an hour earlier, her reflection flickering in the window as the city's neon faded into the distance. Her bag was lighter than Elias's, just a few clothes and her journal, its pages filled with half-finished poems and crossed-out lines. She hadn't slept the night before, her mind a tangle of guilt and longing. Julian's text still sat unanswered on her phone. "Don't go." You know why? She'd ignored it, but his words clung to her like smoke, heavy and inescapable. She loved Elias, or thought she did, but the weight of her betrayal, the kisses with Julian, the nights she'd let herself fall into his orbit made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. Millhaven was supposed to be their moment, but now it felt like a reckoning. They arrived in Millhaven within minutes of each other. The station a bustle of travelers and autumn chill. Elias saw her first, standing by a bench with her hands stuffed in her coat pockets, her dark hair catching the light. His heart leapt, the months of calls and messages collapsing into the single, real moment. "Lila," he called, his voice breaking through the crowd. She turned, and for a second, her smile was everything he'd imagined, bright, unguarded, hers. But as he got closer, he saw the shadows under her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. He chalked it up to nerves, the weight of finally meeting. "Elias," she said, her voice softer than he'd expected. He pulled her into a hug, and she stiffened for a fraction of a second before melting into him. He smelled of cedar and sea air, and for a moment, she wanted to believe it could be simple, that she could be the girl he loved. "You're real," she murmured, and he laughed, the sound warm against her ear. "You're one to talk," he said, pulling back to look at her, crestcoat in the flesh. His eyes were bright, blue as the Ashborough Ocean, and they held her like she was the only thing that mattered. The guilt twisted deeper, but she pushed it down, determined to give him this weekend. Millhaven was as charming as Elias had hoped, its cobblestone streets lined with cafes and bookstores, the river glinting under the afternoon sun. They checked into the airbin, a cozy loft with exposed brick and a view of the water. Elias set his guitar case by the couch, already imagining playing for her later. Lila wandered the space, touching the books on the shelves, avoiding his gaze. When he asked if she was okay, "Just tired," she said, her default excuse. He believed her, or wanted to, and suggested they explore the town. They walked the riverfront, their hands brushing until Elias laced his fingers through hers. It felt right, like a song finding its rhythm, and for a while, Lila let herself sink into it. They stopped at a cafe, sharing a slice of apple pie, laughing when Elias got whipped cream on his nose. He told her about Ashborough's winter storms, how the lighthouse stood steady no matter the weather. She told him about a poetry reading where a drunk heckler had thrown a napkin at her, and they laughed until their sides hurt. For those hours, it was just them, the distance erased, the world small and perfect. But the cracks were still there. At dinner, Lila's phone buzzed on the table, and she flipped it over too quickly, her smile faltering. Elias noticed, but didn't ask, not wanting to break the spell. That night, in the loft, he played Halfway Home for her, his fingers steady on the guitar strings, his voice raw with feeling. Lila listened, her knees pulled to her chest, tears welling as the lyrics washed over her. "You're the light I'm running to, halfway home. It's me and you." When he finished, she kissed him, fierce and desperate, as if she could drown her guilt in his touch. They fell asleep tangled together, her head on his chest, his hand in her hair. The next morning, everything shattered. Elias woke early, slipping out to grab coffee and pastries from a nearby bakery. He left the letter on the pillow, a small act of courage, hoping she'd read it while he was gone. Lila woke to the empty loft, the letter in his neat handwriting staring up at her. She opened it, her hands trembling, and read his words. "I've never been good at saying everything out loud, but you're my home, Lila. No matter how far apart we are, you're where I belong." The weight of it crushed her, the truth of his love clashing with the lie she'd been living. She was still holding the letter when her phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "Miss you already. Come back to me." She didn't hear Elias return, didn't see him standing in the doorway, coffee cups in hand, until he spoke. "Lila." His voice was quiet, but it cut through her like a blade. She flinched, dropping the phone, and the screen lit up with Julian's name. Elias's eyes flicked to it, then back to her, his face a mix of confusion and dread. "Who's that?" he asked, setting the cups down with deliberate care. "No one," she said, too fast, scrambling to pick up the phone. But Elias was quicker, grabbing it before she could. He didn't unlock it, didn't read the message, just held it, his eyes searching hers. "Lila," he said again, softer, like a plea. "What's going on?" She wanted to lie, to say it was a friend, a coworker, anything. But his gaze was too steady, too trusting, and the guilt she'd buried came rushing up. "Elias." Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears spilling over. "I messed up. There's someone else." The words landed like a storm, tearing through the quiet of the loft. Elias froze, the phone still in his hand, his face draining of color. "Someone else," he repeated, as if testing the words, hoping they'd dissolve. "What do you mean, someone else?" Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "His name's Julian. He's in Cresthaven. It wasn't supposed to happen, Elias. It was a mistake, I swear." She told him everything haltingly, painfully about the cafe, the late night walks, the kisses she hadn't stopped. She didn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the hurt she'd caused. Elias listened, his heart fracturing with every word. He thought of the songs he'd written, the letter on the bed, the dreams he'd built around her. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "How long have you been lying to me?" "A month," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe more. I didn't mean to hurt you, Elias. I love you. I do. But I don't. He cut her off, his voice sharp. Don't say you love me. Not now. He set the phone down, his hands shaking, and walked to the window, staring out at the river. The silence was deafening, heavier than any storm in Ashboro. Lila wanted to reach for him, to fix it, but there was no fixing this. Why? He finally asked, turning to face her. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me come here? Let me think. He stopped, his throat tight. I thought you were my home. Lila's heart broke then, not just for him, but for herself, for the girl she'd wanted to be. She saw the life they could have had walks on the pier, his songs, her poems, a love that survived the miles. But she'd chosen Julian's fire over Elias's steadiness, and now she was losing both. I'm sorry, she whispered, but it was empty, a word too small for the damage. Elias packed his bag in silence, his movements mechanical. He left the letter on the bed, its words a ghost of what they'd been. I need to go, he said, not looking at her. I can't be here. He took his guitar and walked out, leaving Lila alone in the loft, the river outside indifferent to her tears. Back in Ashboro, Elias didn't play his guitar for weeks. The ocean felt colder, the bookstore's quiet oppressive. He deleted their playlists, blocked her number, but her voice lingered in his mind, a melody he couldn't unhear. He wrote one last song, untitled, raw and jagged, and played it once. Before locking his guitar away in Cresthaven, Lila's world unraveled. Julian, sensing her guilt, pulled away, his interest fading once the chase was over. Her poetry readings felt hollow, her words flat. She kept Elias's seashell on her desk, holding it to her ear some nights, hoping to hear his voice in the waves. But all she heard was her own regret, a tide that pulled her under. She'd broken his heart, but in doing so, she'd shattered her own, realizing too late that Elias had been her anchor in Cresthaven's storm. The distance between them, once 300 miles, was now infinite. Elias would heal, slowly, finding solace in Ashboro's quiet. Lila would write again, her poems sharper, stained with loss. They'd both carry the scars of Millhaven, a weekend that promised everything and left them with nothing but the echo of what could have been.